One of America's best-known nature poets, Mary Oliver, says that the natural world is a warehouse of symbolic imagery. As Oliver explains, poetry is one of the ancient arts, and it began, as did all the fine arts, within the original wilderness of the earth. Also, it began through the process of seeing and feeling and hearing and smelling and touching, and then remembering in words what these experiences were like, while trying to describe the endless, invisible fears and desires of our inner lives. Embedded in Oliver's observations is a potent writing exercise. If you are interested in tapping into nature's primeval warehouse, then take a notebook and a pen and walk, run, bike, or drive yourself to the nearest field, forest, hill, or shore. Leave your cell phone and your tablet behind. It's crucial that you unplug. You must be completely free from the electronic buzz and hum that fills most of our days. Then walk as far as you have to in order to find a comfortable spot, one where no one else is around. Lean against a tree or sit on a rock and spend at least an hour without distraction. That's right, at least an hour. Take notes on what you see, feel, hear, smell, and touch. Can you taste the saltiness of the air, the flavors of the wind and the weather? You might try putting a bit of dirt on your tongue or feel the squeak of grass between your teeth. Now, if you try this adventure, you really must go out into the wild by yourself. For just as the pings and dings of your personal electronics send out a siren song that's hard to resist, having a companion with you will be just as distracting. The whole point is to let go of the social world as much as possible. You're going into the wilderness in order to remember that you're not just in nature, but that you are nature. Your body is made of dirt. Your breath is air. Once you find that secluded spot, allow yourself to slow down, to be still. Listen, look, smell, taste. Feel your body in this moment, every hair, every nerve. Then jot down what your body is telling you about this place. Now, if you like, you can sketch what you see as well, but don't take any photographs, except the ones you capture in the camera of your mind's eye. The more you disconnect, the more effective this exercise will be. And if you manage to do this exercise more than once, your notes will be all the richer. When you're finished and you return home to your writing place, whether that's your desk, your bed piled high with pillows, or a favorite coffee shop, then read through everything all at once, but with a critical eye. You've now successfully transformed the experience of your own body into language, which is the first step. You've translated the wind and water, the trees and shrubs, the sky and clouds into words on a page. But your task now is to draft a nature essay from these notes, and it can't be a simplistic or sappy one. And let me tell you, that's actually a hard thing to do. Why? Because almost everything you've ever read or seen that represents the natural world, paintings, photographs, and poems alike, they've given you a romantic, glorified vision of nature. Now, these glorified aspects of nature are often accurate. We see a gorgeous sunset, and it rims our hearts with loveliness. On a misty morning, we go for a hike alongside a mountain, and that stirs and stimulates our spirit. Or when we're feeling stressed and overworked and underappreciated, if we spend a week or maybe even just a weekend in a rustic cabin or on the deck of a boat, then nature is our sanctuary from our coffee-addicted, sedentary, email and text message-filled, never enough time to stop and smell the roses lives. We have the celebrated British poet William Wordsworth to thank for the idea of nature as an eternal source of beauty, inspiration, renewal, and refuge. At the turn of the 19th century, Wordsworth and his collaborator, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, witnessed the plight of disadvantaged people all around them. So they cast about for a way to help their fellow men and women. They wanted to find relief for those grappling with the cold realities of industrialization, the horrid living conditions of the working poor, and the rise of consumer culture. As Wordsworth put it, a multitude of causes unknown to former times are now acting with combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind and to reduce it to a state of savage torpor. The most effective of these causes is the increasing accumulation of men in cities, where the uniformity of their occupations produces a craving for intellectual and spiritual stimulation. So what Wordsworth and Coleridge settled on as a spiritual balm to this social plight was the restorative power of the natural world. Nature would become the comfort against the harshness of modernity. The 1798 publication of their collaborative book of poems, the Lyrical Ballads, has been called nothing short of a revolution in poetic form. It is a book that started the Romantic era of literature as we know it. But even as these two writers revolutionized poetry, including the subjects of poems, as well as their narrators and their forms, what interests me more is how this slim, unassuming volume also revolutionized ideas about the natural world. And by natural world, I don't mean nature with a capital N, as in the workings of God in the universe. That's how the writers the century before had defined nature. I really do mean the great outdoors, green grass, tall trees, and blossoming flowers. Prior to the publication of the Lyrical Ballads, a lot of writing characterized global landscapes as places to be explored, tamed, or owned. Europeans and North Americans alike sought to seize, map, and to control nature. And while some pre-Romantic writers turned to the beauties of the pastoral, think of the ways many authors have drawn on the Garden of Eden or the myth of Arcadia. Wordsworth and Coleridge popularized the notion that the rural is the polar opposite of the urban. They are the ones who made nature a place that offers solace from the corruptions of city life. Now, one example of what I mean is a poem by Wordsworth called Tintern Abbey. It has been described as a manifesto on the power of the natural world. In this poem, Wordsworth finds himself back on the banks of a river called the Wye, next to the ruins of an abbey. It's a place he's visited once before, 5 years earlier, and as he looks at the stunning countryside, he says to himself, "Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky." In the years since he was last at this place, Wordsworth says that these beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft, in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. In other words, even when Wordsworth was stuck in a loud, crowded, and dirty city like London, at a time when the city was becoming the industrial capital of Europe, this quiet landscape lived in his memory as a comfort as those sensations sweet he experienced in his body and in his heart. So this scene serves as a kind of mental getaway for him. The banks of the River Wye are Wordsworth's happy place. Even more importantly, as Wordsworth focuses on recalling the riverbank in his imagination, in all its loveliness and tranquility, he also finds a state of sublimity. Now, he describes the sublimity like this: a blessed mood, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, and we see into the life of things. Okay, yeah, it's true. Wordsworth is describing a version of Shavasana, the yoga pose in which you lie on your back and meditate, which I guess makes him a kind of romantic yogi. Here, as in the meditative state, the limits of Wordsworth's body become blurred. His breath and pulse slow down. His mind goes blank, and not to sound too cheesy, he attempts to become one with the universe. Wordsworth says that he is laid asleep in body and becomes a living soul. Then a bit later on, he refines what he means about becoming a living soul. In the poem, he explains that he becomes one with a motion and a spirit that rolls through all things. This motion and spirit that rolls through all things sounds a lot like the divinity of many pantheists, from the Great Spirit of Native American tribes to the Tao of Taoism, to the connection in Hinduism between the Atman, or true self, and the Brahman, or universe. Actually, I'd say that Wordsworth's living soul is also a lot like the Force from George Lucas's Star Wars saga. It's in these ideas of a living soul, as well as a motion and a spirit that rolls through all things, that we find the origins of the ways that we, modern Americans, still think of nature as a place containing a potent spiritual power. Okay, so let's return to what I said about Wordsworth solidifying our belief in nature as a source of beauty, inspiration, renewal, and refuge. Obviously, Wordsworth believed that humans aren't separated in any way from nature. The stuff of the humans is the stuff of the stars. And yet, he idealizes the natural world to such an extent that he winds up making it seem as though human beings should do nothing but feel awe and wonder when rambling about in it. He doesn't go to the next step, to argue that humanity is also responsible for protecting the environment, or for choosing lifestyles that work in tandem with the natural world. Instead, Wordsworth actually dismisses the stamp of humanity on nature. Back in the poem Tintern Abbey, when Wordsworth notices the hedgerows that circle the farms on the other side of the riverbank, and hedgerows signaled land ownership the way we use fences, he's so intent on seeing nature as a pristine sanctuary that he doesn't want to think about how people not only inhabit the natural world, but also modify it and shape it to their will. So he calls them hardly hedgerows and renames them little lines of sportive wood run wild. It's important to Wordsworth that all ugliness and artificiality be located in the cities. All beauty and solace need to be located in nature. So even though we can give Wordsworth credit for showing us the splendors and comforts of nature, there's a problem with making him the primary mentor for modern-day nature essayists. Nature writers who follow in his footsteps tend to produce limited, histrionic, and cliched essays. They wax eloquent, which means they exaggerate and embellish. And as they extol nature, they wind up keeping themselves apart from it. For even though Wordsworth believed that humans are nature and nature is humans, what we've inherited from him is frankly schmaltzy writing that sees the outdoors as distinct from people, as completely separate from the lives we inhabit in our concrete jungles. So as you think about writing your own nature essays, I want to push you beyond Wordsworth. I want you to pay closer attention to his American contemporary, Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau could be called the first environmentalist writer. He is a nature writer who wrestles with people's moral responsibility to protect the earth. And so Thoreau is more influential to the work of modern-day essayists, whose writing is neither schmaltzy nor cliched. These writers tend to be keenly interested in maintaining and preserving nature as a vanishing resource. They also want to understand people's lives as interdependent with the natural world. If Wordsworth was the dreamer, Thoreau was the doer. Thoreau was a skilled carpenter and handyman. He surveyed land and could make his own pencils. He was also an activist. He argued against slavery, as well as his government's involvement in the Mexican-American War, which he saw as an attempt to expand slave territory. And he was actually put in jail because he refused to pay a tax that he saw as supporting slavery. Thoreau's jail time inspired what became his best-known essay, Resistance to Civil Government. In it, he argues that if a law requires any citizen to be the agent of injustice to another, then break the law. This essay became the inspiration for passive resistance to all manner of oppressions, strategies that were championed by Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, almost a century after Thoreau wrote this essay. In terms of Thoreau's writings on nature, he didn't draw on his memories as Wordsworth did. Instead, Thoreau went out to live in nature. As everyone knows, Thoreau built a small cabin on land owned by his friend and fellow writer Ralph Waldo Emerson. This cabin was next to a place called Walden Pond. "I went to the woods," Thoreau said, "because I wished to live deliberately and see if I could not learn what life had to teach, and not, when I came to die, to discover that I had not lived." As an early environmentalist, Thoreau was among the first Americans to speak in favor of preserving parts of our landscape as a national resource for creating protected parks and forests. He'd witnessed the beginnings of urban sprawl around his hometown of Concord, Massachusetts. He saw entrepreneurs cutting down forests to clear farmland to build houses and to sell wood as fuel, and he worried about the consequences of such logging. He wrote that each town should have a park of 500 or 1,000 acres where a stick should never be cut for fuel. Thoreau went on to say that this land should be a common possession forever for instruction and recreation. And he even made a clarion call on behalf of conserving nature. "Let us keep the new world new and preserve all the advantages of living in the country." So, Thoreau is a good model for contemporary essayists who write about nature, particularly those who hope to improve the health of the planet by taking on issues of pollution, biodiversity, and sustainability. These nature essayists adopt his environmentalist perspective and speak to the symbiotic connections between humans and the natural world. And this political approach is more in keeping with the spirit of our modern moment than Wordsworth's spiritual musings or those writers who focus exclusively on the miracle and the grandeur of the earth. So it's with Thoreau in mind that I want you to return to those notes you took while spending quiet time out in a field, a forest, a mountain, or a beach. Now let me stress that I'm not saying that you must write like Thoreau or like Wendell Berry, who's been called the modern-day Thoreau. For one thing, the observations of Thoreau and Berry alike are often very bleak. Berry equates the machine of human history to the workings of an insane greed, hungering for the world's end, a civilization of which the work of no artist is the symbol, nor the life of any good man, but rather the bulldozer, the poison spray, the hugging fire of napalm, and the cloud of Hiroshima. I'm not insisting that your own approach be that bleak. Although, if you want to shake people awake about impending environmental disasters, then by all means, go for bleak. What I am suggesting, regardless of your topic intent or tone, is that you approach your nature essay by being as even-handed as you can, as well as self-conscious. To better understand what I mean, let me offer some examples. To be even-handed, it's important not to romanticize nature. You want to show that while nature is gorgeous and awe-inspiring, it's also, in the words of the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, red in tooth and claw. Nature is violent, containing as much death as green growing life, and you shouldn't shy away from describing the harsher elements of the natural world. Deb Marquardt, a poet, musician, and highly successful environmental essayist, has written a good deal about growing up on a farm in North Dakota. In a piece she called Chores that she published in the Orion magazine, Marquardt writes of the endless tasks that must be undertaken on any farm. Her essay doesn't yearn for the bucolic lifestyle that is represented by red barns, blue skies, and rows of corn so neat and tidy that they look like strands on a loom. That's just an advertisement for a farm, an image on the milk carton at the grocery store. Instead, Marquardt tells it like it is. While humans and nature must work hand in glove to grow food and to raise animals, that work is difficult and dirty. Even the word chores shows how hard and unpleasant it is going to be. Marquardt says, chores, never singular, always plural, a job that interrupts some fun you're having and then grows and grows like polyps in an intestine. It's best to avoid chores, pretend you didn't hear the call, hope someone else will do them, than to skitter across a cold wood floor in the dark, pull on old clothes and worn, smelly shoes, and go out into the drafty, manure-smeared places where such chores are done. Her essay then takes the reader directly into those manure-smeared places. She writes, I've seen manure in a variety of colors and consistencies. I have sprayed it with a hose, swept it into gutters, scraped it, buried it, burned it, and shoveled it. I've been up to my bootstraps in it, threatening to suck me down as I tried to step through it, spreading straw with a pitchfork. Marquardt also reveals the not very romantic work of separating calves from their mothers, of castrating bulls, and of slaughtering chickens. This is no sentimental view of animal husbandry. This is blood and guts, and lots of manure. But I said that the contemporary nature writer needs to be even-handed, and Marquardt is. In addition to detailing how her family ran frantically from place to place to perform all the chores that kept the farm afloat, she also relates the beautiful simplicity of a cream separator that she got to babysit as a teenager to keep the farm's cats out of the cream. Nestled in a cozy closet off the milkroom, the separator made transforming magic. As she clutched her book and read about all the strange places and marvelous people in the outside world, she shooed away tomcats and tabbies, and the separator delivered its steady stream of cream that flowed like gold. This is a picture of creation, of how nature takes what's dead and puts it right back into the life of the living, whether milk from the cow or words on a page that spark a young girl's imagination. This scene shows that our environment is continuous, mysterious, and self-sustaining. But I'm going to argue that it's not enough for a nature essayist to be even-handed. You also have to be self-conscious, self-aware, for whatever other people do to the world around you is also being done to you. You need to take nature personally. Or as Wendell Berry says, all wildernesses are one. So whether you want to write about global climate change or empty oceans or the small dramas of life and death playing out in your garden, you need to recognize and to internalize that these topics are also about you. You are organic. And you don't need an FDA-approved label to affirm it. Humans are closer in kith and kin to the cockroach in the pantry and to the 20-foot cherry tree in front of the house than we are to either our jobs or our cell phones. Let me conclude then by giving you an example of a self-conscious writer who might surprise you. For a number of years, He's kept a blog called Rants from the Hill. He's also a professor of literature and the environment and a self-proclaimed desert rat who lives in the Great Basin Desert of Nevada. His name is Michael P. Branch, and by using humor, his Rants from the Hill push the envelope of the traditional nature essay. Branch covers an eclectic range of topics, such as keeping expensive chickens with beady eyes that he describes as dark pinpricks of nothingness, raising a feral daughter who is equal parts cute little girl, simian beast, and Hollywood stunt double, and how to send off your dead dog to his happy hunting ground. As Branch writes, the best way to commemorate a dog's life is to take his cremated remains and with a wooden-handled spade and an ice-cold IPA, hike up to a nearby hillside that is graced by a single juniper. Then dig a small hole and raise a toast to your departed friend with your India Pale Ale. Finally, kneel down among the sage and plant your dog. Apart from Branch's mix of the serious and silly, delivered with his razor-sharp wit, what makes his nature essays stand apart is how self-conscious they are about his own intimacy with nature. Branch never holds nature at arm's length. He understands completely that every decision he makes impacts the natural world in some profound way, and vice versa. For instance, in a rollicking essay called Lawn Guilt, Branch's self-consciousness is quite evident. First, he cites Henry David Thoreau, but not by giving the reader a dignified picture of this national icon. Instead, Branch writes, Thoreau's neighbors generally thought of him as a lazy, confrontational, sanctimonious pain in the ass. But he turned out to be right about nearly everything, including his claim that the American relationship to nature was becoming commodified, superficial, and exploitative. But perhaps the best example of Thoreau being ahead of his time, Branch concludes, is offered by his vehement condemnation of the American lawn. Thoreau wrote that hope and the future are not in lawns. Branch then lists a whole bevy of reasons why Americans shouldn't keep lawns, as other nature writers, notably Michael Pollan, have done before him. Branch has done his homework too. He first poses a riddle to his reader. Considered acre for acre, he asks, what is the most pesticide, herbicide, water, labor, and cash-intensive crop grown in the U.S.? Without missing a beat, he says, right, your lawn. Then he proves his point with cold, hard data. In America, Branch explains, our turf grasses, which are non-native, cover 21 million acres, think the state of Maine, cost $40 billion per year, more than U.S. foreign aid, consume around 90 million pounds of fertilizer and 80 million pounds of pesticides per year, which sometimes end up contaminating our ground and surface water, and drink an inconceivable 8 billion gallons of water per day. Even more, lawns are a colossal time suck and foster the opposite of biodiversity. Lawns are, of course, monocultures. So Branch concludes that all in all, cultivating a lawn is simply not a good idea for the health and welfare of the planet or its people. And then he steps down from his eco soapbox to make a confession. I have a lawn. Of course, Branch says, my dual status as arid lands environmentalist and lawn watering dolt has provoked in me a serious identity crisis. Am I proud of my lawn? Hell no! I'm completely ashamed of it. I have a terminal case of lawn guilt. So here's the self-consciousness at work. This nature writer isn't just condemning what others do to plants, animals, the land, the oceans, the sky, or the planet writ large. No. Branch is admitting that he himself is doing these dastardly things to the natural world too. From here, Branch explains why he has a lawn in the middle of a desert. It's a more inviting place for his daughters to play than the hardpan that stretches to the horizon. It's also an oasis of sorts for bugs and birds, lizards and coyotes, the only moist patch for miles around, and so it's a bit of real estate that sustains certain members of the desert population. And it also serves as a fire break, one that helps to cool his house in the heat of summer, working together with his passive solar home that makes it possible for his family to exist without air conditioning. But Branch still doesn't let himself off the hook. Thoreau would have seen right through this turf grass apologia, he says, and he would have instantly called horsepucky on my cowardly rebranding of the unsustainable indulgence that is my lawn as a fire break. The self-consciousness returns with a vengeance. Rejecting an easy resolution, Branch dwells in ambiguity. He says that he'll eventually drown his lawn in sand when his daughters go off to college, and we do believe him, given that he's demonstrated such diffidence. In the meantime, though, he ends his essay by switching from Thoreau to Walt Whitman, who sang praises of blades of grass as the beautiful, uncut hair of graves. In other words, Branch embraces his own hypocrisy, and we in turn acknowledge the environmental contradictions in our own lives. How we recycle but drive SUVs, how we compost but run air conditioners. It's a nature writer's willingness to be self-conscious, coupled with an even-handedness about the beauty and the horror that is nature, that will make all the difference in transforming your nature notes into an environmental essay. Turn Branch's critical eye onto yourself. How do you impact the natural world? In what ways do you respect nature? In what ways do you ignore or harm it? How is your version of nature idealized? How might you be more realistic? What is beautiful about nature? But what is ugly and brutal? And finally, how might you use what you have discovered about being nature yourself, dust to dust and breath to breath, when you sit down to draft your own nature essay, your own call to action?